Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to FSC Connect. Today's conversation is very much focused on the FSC Code and its focus on helping to support a strong customer-focused culture. You know, the FSC Code, I remember joining the FSC a few years ago, and there was a conversation led by Rob Flanagan, the chair, which was all about the FSC needs to have a code of conduct for the members. And that was kind of the vision. And it took a while to think about what that actually was going to be, what it was going to look like. And I remember the debates over a number of years as we kind of unpacked and teased out what should be in the code. Because if you're going to end up in the world of self-regulation, you kind of need to be clear about what your objectives are. Of course, when we started the conversation, this was before FSLA, it was before COFI, it was before the Hayne Royal Commission, it was before a lot of things, and it was really designed as a piece of work for the FSC and the sector to step up to the plate and say, look, we need to ensure that conduct in the sector is strong, is robust, and that actually we're taking account of this ourselves, not because we have to, but because we want to and because it's the right thing to do from a consumer perspective. So that's a little bit about the origins. Fast forward now to 2023. The code's been going for a while. We've had our first training review, and we're delighted today to have a conversation that unpacks some of this discussion around the code. Whilst I'm doing the intros, I'm much more delighted to welcome Charlotte Cockrell, Kristen Smith, and Steve Burgess. Charlotte as chair of our Code Governance Committee. Kristen and Steve are long-time participants in and around the FSC Code and the sector, and are going to bring their perspective. So warm welcome. Thanks for your patience. It is 20 to 4. And with that, I'm going to hand happily to Charlotte. Charlotte, welcome.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks for that introduction. And look, thank you to everyone joining this webinar this afternoon to discuss all things FSC Code. So look, firstly, I thought I'd set the context for this webinar, the purpose of which is to remind the FSC members of the Code of Conduct, its purpose and how it applies. So look, as Richard's just mentioned, the code has been in effect now for almost 5 years, and I believe during that time the FSC membership has grown to more than 110 members. When it was first came into effect, there was a significant launch of the code, including training. And look, it's probably timely to do a bit of a reminder of the code, and to what Richard just mentioned, there has just been a review of the code. So what better time to sort of remind people what the code is and what the standards are. And look, so this discussion is to also provide some practical examples around how the code continues to support good customer outcomes, and there will be some time for some Q&A at the end. So please put through your questions and we'll get through what we can at the end. The first part is to just provide members with an overview of the FSC Code. And as noted, there are several newer members, hopefully on this webinar, who come from different backgrounds and different industries. So look, before we get into some panel discussion, it would be good to look back and look at the development of the code itself. So the FSC vision was to continue to grow the financial confidence and well-being of New Zealanders, and to support members in committing to delivering those strong customer outcomes and building a sustainable financial services sector. As Richard sort of mentioned in the intro, the code, the development of the code started way back in 2016. It was approved by the FSC Code board in 2018, and it came into effect in January 2019. I guess during this time as well, you know, there were significant reviews of the financial services sector, both in Australia with the Royal Commission's review into misconduct of financial services, which highlighted the many risks of getting it wrong and not putting customers first. And then obviously that led into some reviews undertaken here by regulators in 2018, 2019 with the conduct and culture reviews, which then highlighted a number of weaknesses in managing conduct across businesses. And obviously the regulator expects that organisations do promote good customer outcomes and continue to do so. So the FSC, as Richard explained, worked together to develop a code of conduct to promote that good conduct or a good, strong customer-focused culture, and demonstrate that continuous improvement. The development of the code was a really important step in supporting the professionalism of the financial services industry. It set those clear ethical standards by which we work by, that we can follow, and it also helps provide that consistency of similar principles and behaviour, and ultimately builds that consumer trust. And that's what it's really about, building that trust and confidence in the providers of financial services. So a bit about who needs to comply with the code. So as a member of an FSC, must comply with the code. The FSC rules state that members must comply with the rules and any codes, any codes of conduct and standards, and obviously act in a way that maintains and enhances the good image of the industry. So all three, so Kristen, myself, and Stephen are all members of the Code Governance Committee, and the role of that committee is to, I guess, oversee the FSC code and is responsible for ensuring that the code is fully implemented and managed. Just by way of background, currently there are about 10 members of that committee, and we really oversee and drive the development of the code, and support FSC members to ensure they have, the right materials to understand the code. So that was probably a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the development of the code and its purpose. So I thought it would be good now to sort of have a look of an overview of the code and the standards, which are on the slide in front of you. So there are 9 code standards focused around sort of 3 core objectives. The first being the principal ethical standard, ensuring business is carried out professionally and with due care, competence and skill, and that we act with integrity. The next core objective of the code is the customer perspective standards, so ensuring there's sort of two-way effective communication between members and their customers, and also making sure that members provide their customers with sufficient information to make decisions around the products and services that they're offering. And then thirdly is the delivering of good customer outcomes, ensuring effective products distribution, making sure that the right training is in place, risk management, and the fair treatment of customers. There was also additional guidance developed by the FSC in 2020, and while the standards are binding to all members, the guidelines are aspirational and provide examples depending on the industry and organisation that you're working in, and all that guidance and obviously the code is all available on the FSC website. Look, as mentioned earlier, the code has recently been reviewed. This was part of a mandatory 3-yearly review that's required by the code itself. The main objective of the review is to ensure that the code meets the expectations of its members, consumers, and regulators. And the review was intended to ensure the code was fit for purpose and remained relevant for members going forward. The review commenced last year, and the findings were recently presented to the FSC board, and we had an FSC working group who was tasked with undertaking that review. Kristen, you were part of the working group that undertook the review. It'd be great if you could sort of give a rundown of what the scope was, the approach, who was involved, and the outcomes.
Kia ora, thanks, Charlotte. Yes, I was part of the working group and joined the beginning of last year. And it really took quite a comprehensive approach to reviewing the code. So we first went out and collected feedback from members. We did that through some focus groups, online surveys, a lot of one-on-one conversations. That was sort of end of 2021 through early 2022. We also took a piece to look at what was happening sort of around the world with other relevant industries and what they were doing for their code of conduct, what their expectations were for their members, any other relevant legislation and regulation that was out there. And then really sort of towards the end of last year was analyzing all the information, all the feedback, putting it together, making those recommendations. And as Charlotte mentioned, we then took it through earlier this year through to the board and kind of made our recommendations just to make sure it was still fit for purpose, that it was meeting the members' needs, and it was helping us as sort of as a group and as an industry to really lift that capability of everyone, make sure we all had the sort of this common language and that consistency between all the different members.
And Kristen, with the sort of, do you want to give a rundown of the outcomes of the review?
Yeah, so it was quite interesting that it was really more just to try and validate that the actual standards we had were still fit for purpose. We made some initial recommendations to the board, and so there wasn't any real significant changes. There's no new codes have been introduced or anything like new standards, I should say. But the guidance has come through, and then certainly some of the points that were things like that we wanted to make sure that we were sharing the purpose of the code, like in sessions like this, and also working on how we can communicate that better with our members and figure out also how we can help support new members that are joining FSC as well.
Yeah, thanks. And look, I think it's a really good opportunity to thank the FSC working group. Hopefully there are some on this webinar today. A lot of hard work went into that review, and it was a huge effort.
Charlotte, can I just ask Kristen a question?
Yeah, sure.
Richard here. Just Kristen, for the people on the call, what's the difference between code standards and code guidance? How did the review process kind of think about those two ideas?
So you try and take I guess the code standards are really principles based, whereas the guidance is more to give kind of more practical examples and how it would look in the different businesses. And I think that was kind of our focus, is how do you bring that to life? I think in talking, and certainly as a member of the working group, different organizations have, depending on the size of the business and people's, how long the company's been around for and things like that, there's sort of a different level of maturity. So really it's being able to take the standards and sort of bring them to life a little bit.
Sorry, Charlotte, because Kristen, again, just, sitting inside the membership are, global organizations, trans-Tasman organizations with significant kind of risk and compliance capability, but equally there are a number of smaller start-out fund managers and other organizations. How did the code, when you were going through the review, how did that kind of principle kind of play out in terms of what was going to fly?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Richard, because we did look at it that that you don't want to make it just one thing that's sort of a cookie cutter approach, that the standard will be the same for every single member, because just like you said, there's such a wide range of the FSC members, and not making it not to overlap too much with other existing regulations as well. That if, for example, the Privacy Act, we don't need to necessarily be saying something like that for our members to be holding them to account when we know that there's other legislation out there as well.
Right. Thanks for that. So sorry to ask the question, Charlotte.
No, that's all good. And look, I think one of the recommendations from review was that we will at some point look at the guidance to make sure that it's still relevant and in line with not just regulations but regulatory expectations. So that's something in action that is still to do going forward. So I guess that brings us to let's talk a bit more about the code. So that we're here today discussing how the code supports a strong customer-focused culture, and also how it helps members deliver those good customer outcomes. So I might start by asking the panel, Stephen, I'll start with you, why is the code important, not just generally, but also for relevant sectors?
I think it's always important that we have certain guidelines to uphold our behaviors or our conduct to. And certainly being a member of the FSC is a great step, but knowing and understanding that there's also an independently created code that holds the industry as a whole to a higher standard. I think that's very important for businesses. And, when you look at the code and how it was created and the methodology behind it, a lot of that aligns really well to how we should be doing business, the outcomes of the Australia Royal Commission, Kofi and those kinds of things. So I think it's really strong in terms of an industry standard and increasing the standards in the industry, and also championing that we do have those standards in the industry and how important it is that these are our values and this is what we want to move forward with.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, completely agree. Kristen, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Steve, and I think that was part of certainly in the code working group when we were talking about it, talking to Richard's point about guidance and what the standards were. We wanted to make sure that members understood that the intention is for it to complement what each individual firm or business, your own internal code of conduct that you would have for your staff, and certainly it's also to complement what many of us would. If you say the code in New Zealand, a lot of people I think about the code of professional conduct for financial advice services. They think about the one that are for financial advisors, but this one really is for our membership. So this is kind of like Steve said, establishing kind of the expectations, making sure that there's that consistency, and it's broader than just the advice side or broader than what you as a staff member would need to do for your business. So it really is more about the membership and us as an industry.
Yeah. That probably leads me to my next question. The code is intended to complement, existing legislation and also operate in conjunction with other industry codes of standards. And there is a lot out there. So members have a number of different regulations and codes, including probably their own internal organisation codes of standards that they need to comply with. We've got FMCA, we've got the Code of Professional Conduct for financial advice services. So how does the code fit into and support existing regulations, compliance obligations, and industry codes? Stephen, do you want to launch in first?
Sure, I'll take that. Yeah, and I think when you look at it and you really read through and then you look at the guidance, it clearly is an excellent way to complement those. And add some value across the industry and some consistency across the industry. And I think, what we've seen in terms of the movements, especially in the last probably 5 to 7 years, where we're going, like the code very much aligns to that. And it holds the industry as a whole to a standard. But when you're looking at like internally and you're building like a conduct regime in your business, a conduct governance regime, and different things like that, as you were preparing for, the FSLA updates and those kinds of things, it certainly adds a layer there that I think aligns to most of those, that allows you to kind of keep things in a nice little basket for everybody, but also gives that layer of external independence, which I think is really important.
And I think too, sorry, go ahead, Richard.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, I think for a lot of us, for the companies we work for, our code of conduct sometimes is a little bit more on culture and sort of what your values as a business and what you'd expect. Whereas this one, I think for the FSC, it's a bit broader. And also we have to recognize not all FSC members would necessarily be involved in Kofi. They wouldn't necessarily be financial institutions. So you do want to have that broader view of kind of expectations and what we as an industry body would like to see for customers that would lead to good customer outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really an important discussion because there are lots of other codes that large and small organizations kind of need to abide by. But if you just step back from that and you think about the sector we're in, we're in the sector that manages people's wealth, invests people's wealth, protects their wealth, provides advice. We're basically in the trust business. And so you kind of have to have a measure and a benchmark that says, when you come into the sector, this is what you can expect. Now, most customers, I don't think, go and read voraciously what's in the license and what's on the wall, and they kind of expect that there's a trust because we're in the fiduciary business, we're in the trust business, we're in the money business. So I think that's kind of the principal point where we started, and so we hold ourselves collectively to that account. Now, of course, there are other regulators and lawmakers and common law and so on that have that as well. And the idea of the code is to complement that rather than to either supersede it or to replace it. And if I go back to 2016, we we did have a conversation about, how prescriptive does this code need to be? And one of the early observations that people said, they said, gee, this is pretty high level and it's pretty principles based, and it's actually fairly common sense. Like, it makes sense, because the other piece we wanted to reach into organizations and not go, codes are the remit of the legal and compliance team, although that's often where they live. But if you're designing products, or if you're in frontline distribution, or if you're in product manufacture or customer service, claims, complaints, whatever, the code has to be relevant to those job roles as well. So the writing of it in the high-level principle nature, which talks about what members must do, so it's a very must do this and must do that, with the guidance in underneath that, kind of complements that what else is out there. And every day the sector's on show to the millions of customers that we serve. And so the code becomes a really important measuring stick, if you will, of are we turning up every day across the thousands, tens of thousands of employees and businesses across the sector when we sit in front of New Zealanders and help them make the right decisions about their futures. So that's kind of some of the other part of where it's coming from.
Yeah, look, and I think that's one of the good things about it being principles based as well, and it provides members the ability to apply it as it best suits them. And obviously we've just gone through a three-yearly review, and the feedback on that was it is still relevant and it is still appropriate. So look, I think there are a number of members on this webinar who will be required to comply with COFI. So that's the Conduct of Financial Institution legislation. Look, noting that we've just had an election and National's view that it might simplify those COFI rules, let's put that aside for now. But I wonder, does anyone have any views on how the incoming, I guess, COFI legislation may impact the code?
I think it aligns nicely with the code, to be honest.
I agree.
You look, there's a real conduct lens over the code, which is fantastic. And like, as I look at it and I think about the firms that we're working with in COFI and that kind of thing, like if you think about risk appetites and those kinds of things, this aligns very well into that space of where the maturity is. And I think if anything, it just bolsters it a little bit that there is an industry standard, an independent industry standard that holds you up to that as well. What are your thoughts, Kristen?
Oh, I was just going to jump in because Charlotte reminded me of when we were, because the working group did take sort of a year and a half going through this whole process and collecting information. And at the early stages, at that point, we, as many of you would remember, we as an industry believed that FMA was going to be releasing more guidance on good conduct, and it looked like that they might be refreshing their conduct guidance. And then when that sort of changed earlier this year, we as a working group were like, we're not going to wait on this any longer. We feel comfortable and secure with the way that our standards are, and this is how we're not going to keep. We're not going to delay anything, waiting to see if things change politically or from FMA, that this really is something that we supported, and certainly it does support customer outcomes, just like Steve was saying. So it makes sense for it. It passes the test of time a little bit, so we don't need to hold out for it.
And I agree. You guys.
I was just going to say, it's just common sense in how to deal with customers and do right and create fair outcomes and that kind of thing. I don't think anything in the code is in any way controversial or how you wouldn't want yourself or your parents or your family to be treated by an institution.
Yeah, I agree. I guess maybe this is a question for Richard. Will there be I'm not sure, Kristen, if the FMA's guidance around COFI was out when you were doing the review. And again, I think we're all in agreement that it aligns quite nicely. But will there be any, I guess, further review of the code in line with the conduct legislation, or is there any sort of plans to review anything further?
I think the points Stephen and Kristen made are the right ones, which is, politicians come and go every 3 years. Regulation changes according to whoever's running running the policy engine room. In the end, the sector needs to make its own calls independent of what's going on for the right reasons. We're not. That doesn't mean we're going to be naive to potential changes around the place and perhaps the need for tweaks. But I think the principle around COFI and what it's trying to achieve at an institutional level, broadly, the sector has been very supportive of. There are a few things that you could perhaps simplify that may or may not happen, to your point, Charlotte. But the broad thrust is heading in the right direction, like with the code as well. So, the code needs to be cognizant of what's around it, but it doesn't need to be chopping and changing every time either politicians or regulators kind of jump left or right if that's what they choose to do.
Yeah. So, look, as mentioned earlier, members are responsible for complying with the code. So how should the code and standards form part of an organisation's, risk appetite, compliance programs, governance and risk reporting, and what might this look like? Stephen, what's your view with what you've seen?
Yeah, so I think we're in generally dealing with kind of medium to larger size entities. I think it should essentially sit in that kind of chief risk officer space where, there's a lot of awareness there, and that's part of the overall governance framework and how they're doing risk assessments and what the priorities are. And then it should obviously filter down from there. And what we're seeing is a lot of companies I think would fit in here very well, maybe just with a little bit of maturity in terms of their governance, or updating some wording. But I think in a good faith effort, a lot of companies are meeting the standard or relatively close to meeting the standard now. It's just about a little bit of maturation and a little bit of visibility at that higher end spot. So when you are kind of, I guess you have that waterfall down from the top, that it's built in culturally and it's discussed and there's training and people know that, there is an industry body that has a code. And I think that's very important that people do know that and they are trained on what the code is. And that goes along with obviously your internal training on if you've got your own code and what your own rules and policies and procedures and controls are.
Yeah, and Krista, do you have anything to add from, I guess, experience from a life insurance perspective?
Yeah, I think it for us, and leading into exactly what Steve was saying, I think it reinforces what we already have and do. So I know sort of leaning ahead a little bit, it's really just sort of up to the individual organization how they bring it to life. So I know, for example, I'm from Partners Life, and so we've had the posters on the wall that were released. I think when probably the season, the one just before this. So we had those around the office, and we had like an e-learn module that all staff, it's mandatory for them to complete, so that our staff all realized within that first month of joining Partners Life that this is part of one of the many things that we hold the expectations that we have for staff and why it's important to us. But I think also, to Steve's point, you see I think the involvement that a lot of us probably on this call have with the FSC already. Like a number of us are on different committees or contribute our time to conference planning or attending the conferences, and so it's kind of that continuous part of bringing the code standards to life and how we interact with each other.
Yeah, look, and I was sort of going to ask about, members are, responsible for educating their staff and people on, and I think the first thing is to make sure your people are aware that there is an FSC code. And look, I know that the FSC, when the code was first launched, put out some really in-depth and good training material, which includes both, I think, some facilitator guidance and educational material, and that's their design, and that's certainly what we used when the code was first launched, and obviously you can use it to best suit your organisation. It has some really good case studies and examples, and I believe that's still available on the website that anyone can access it at any time.
I think those resources are really good. Like that's an
yeah,
ideal resource for a business to use,
yeah,
to both kind of build awareness and then even internal training. It just adds a lot of value for a business to have
yeah. And
resources like that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to do that ongoing training. So, usually this can form part of, conduct induction modules, but it's also important to do those refresher conduct modules, each year, so that it's front of mind for people across your organisations.
And I think that's a good call out, Charlotte, just probably for the members that are on the call right now, that if they're listening to us talking and thinking, I'm not sure if my business or organization has that, maybe to nip away and check and see if it is something that the group is familiar with.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
And it's a great resource for CPD. Not a lot of effort into
it. So look, talking a little bit more about compliance with the code, members, I should know about it and be trained on it, but also be able to demonstrate how they are complying with the code. And so, we've talked about members coming from different industries. We've got life, health, KiwiSaver, workplace savings, investment. And look, some of the standards and guidelines may be directly or indirectly applicable. But they should be obviously applied in the context of your business model. So I thought maybe now we could go through some of the code standards and maybe provide some ideas and practical examples of how organizations can demonstrate that they are supporting those good customer outcomes. So I'll start with the first code standard, which is members must carry out business professionally with due care, competence, and skill, and act with integrity. So Steve, I might throw this one to you to discuss how you might demonstrate this.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Charlotte. I think, well, with this and a lot of them, it comes back to kind of what you're doing at that high level, and that you demonstrate that you've got policies in place, that you've got controls in place that are measurable. And I think that was one of the things that came out of the Royal Commission is, you need to have things that are measurable and, be able to actually evidence what you're doing. And some of the guidance in here, I think, is really good. It talks about what systems, processes, and evidence do you have in place to support good conduct and identify poor conduct? And those, I think, are very important. So what we see businesses do is they have a scorecard, or they have a number of measurables that are often very fluid. So they're actually able to say, this is what we're doing, this is what we're learning, and this is the outcome. And this is how it impacts our customers, which I think is hugely important to any business. And then that falls right down to, educating the business and reporting throughout the business, including all the way up to the board if you're identifying risks and what you're actually doing once you've identified those.
Yeah. So I mean, it just forms part of your wider, risk management framework, doesn't
it?
Yeah. So standard 2 is talks about members must communicate with customers clearly and effectively. Kristen, do you have any good examples of how this might what this might look like?
Yeah, for sure. So this one, I think when you try and think about how would you actually check and make sure that you're doing this properly, I particularly like this one and the next one, number 3, because they link really closely with my role at Partners Life. I'm involved with the Kofi project, so I'm all about fair conduct principle and how we can bring that to life as well. So for us, I would think in terms of making sure you can demonstrate that is you want to be able to show that you're actually looking at what you send your customers. And so things like you're reviewing your templates that you have for customer comms, like your letters and welcome packs, things like that. But also your products as well, doing those, having a good rigorous either annual or as appropriate review cycle for them. And certainly we would also look at like our complaints register. That's the other way that you find out. That's where customers will tell you. That's where you're going to pick up that really rich data of if you're not communicating with your customers clearly and effectively, that's where you're going to hear about it. And so doing that training and supporting your staff to really capture the detail and figure out what's gone wrong and then how can we prevent it, sort of using those insights to fix it from happening in the future.
Yeah, look, and I think it's also it's being able to communicate clearly and effectively into different groups of people, right? So we know that we should be looking at different communications for different people, particular vulnerable customers. Yeah. So working out how to do that and the best way to do that.
I think that's a really good point in terms of, different types of customers. We always think of what sophistication level customers have. And you're right. In terms of different vulnerabilities, different languages, Auckland's a very multicultural place. New Zealand is as a whole. Your strategy should reflect that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next standard is members must take reasonable efforts to ensure that customers are provided with sufficient information to make decisions about their products and services. So, Kristen, do you want to?
Yeah, I think this one dovetails nicely with the second one. I mean, these are both under the customer's perspective. I guess the point I wanted to separate is if you look at, the one that we use for financial advice, that one is sort of giving advice that's suitable, ensuring the client understands the financial advice. Whereas this standard that we have for FSC, this is broader than just advice. It's really talking about all of the information that you're giving them, sort of the whole product life cycle. So where you might be servicing them in the middle or exiting, there's all the different touch points that you'd have for those customers. And to Steve's point, really looking at our information so that it is in plain English and that you're explaining things in a way, and also making sure that you're thinking of customers who are in vulnerable circumstances, who maybe might not understand it. How can we support them better to either send them information in a different way? If maybe if trying to speak on the phone is difficult, then maybe ask if you can email it to them or post it to them, so they maybe can review it with a friend or family member or with their financial advisor if that's the situation, just to try and make sure that they really understand what's going on with their product.
Yeah, so it's also the accessibility piece, right? Making sure it's designed for different types of customers in different situations. So the next standard is members must seek and consider customer feedback. So I guess the question that organisations should be asking themselves is how are they considering customer feedback, and then how might that be different depending on the type of organisation that you're in. Look, I think most members will have in place complaints processes, NPS or satisfaction surveys for customers to provide feedback. I think a lot of us will all be required to have complaints processes anyway, by regulation or other standards that we need to comply with. But I think for this one, it's really important it's about being proactive. So understanding, or at least, and to do that, documenting your customer journey, right? And ensuring that you're asking for feedback along that customer journey, obviously from Fidelity, a life insurer. So not just at the point someone takes out a policy, but throughout their whole, life of the policy, from, claims time to cancellation. And, I think it's also about being able to use feedback and data to then identify themes and trends, and that sort of whole continuous improvement going forward. I don't know if Kristen or Stephen, you have anything to add to that?
I was just going to make a small addition to that, if that's okay. I was just going to say that it is not always the easiest to get relevant customer feedback. I know in the last couple of big international events we've seen, like NPS scores, who everybody touts their NPS score. A lot of the banks in the GFC went bust and had really good NPS scores. And what they realized is that's actually just a test of potentially interaction for a minute, as opposed to so it is really hard, and these should be really fluid. And I think that came out in the Royal Commission, that a lot of people were getting bad outcomes, but they seem to be very happy that they just talked to somebody who was nice to them. So it's one of those things that I think has to have some architecture behind it in terms of what you're actually trying to learn, and are you actually digging deep enough to get to the outcome.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good point. yeah, it's I think it's probably what it's that whole lead indicator thing, right? So I think everyone's still trying to work out how best to do that and how to what is the right way. So moving to the next sentence, so members must design and distribute products responsibly. Stephen, what are your sort of thoughts on this one?
I think this is one where probably the most work needs to be done in the market at the moment. And I think it's really important, and this was called out in the Royal Commission as well. A lot of these have underlying themes going back to that. But this one's really important. I think you look across the industry now and you see a lot of what we'd call legacy products that are existing out there, and everybody wishes they could go away, but nobody knows how to make that happen. But there's a lot of things in that, when you're designing and distributing products, how are you doing that? How are you doing that fairly? I think you see a lot of the remediations, the FMA remediations right now, or a lot of those are, yes, you had a product, but did you actually implement the different variables, multi-policy discounts, those kinds of things? So it's really important that when you're designing a product, that you do consider the customer life journey in mind, and not just today and how you're going to market it, but as you go along. And the code covers that really well. And for those of you, I'd encourage you to read the guidance. I think it fits really well to where we are with conduct obligations.
Yeah, I think you raised some really good points, and I think from the life insurance sector as well, there's been a huge amount of change over even just the last 10 years, right? So so the next standard is members must provide employees and distribution channels with the appropriate training. So I guess, Kristen, from your experience at Partners Life, what are some good ways to do this?
Yeah, so for us, I think this is, again, that knowledge, competence, and skill, but it's broader than that. This is really talking about our staff, and then also how our products get to our, how they're distributed. So in where I work, for us, mainly it's independent financial advisors, usually financial advice providers that are, ultimately providing the advice and selling the products to customers. So for us, we do it in a couple different ways, probably like a lot of folks on the call. So we have e-learn modules that we do in-person trainings, we do webinars, and then there's also kind of the ongoing training. The real point I think I'd like to make, and this is something, I think I come from a risk and compliance background like Steve does as well. And really you want to make sure that you have evidence of that. So you want to make sure you're reviewing it regularly, that you keep the screenshots, that you have staff who are in that role that know if it's still correct, or if we change things anytime there's something materially different, keeping those recording the records of not only the content, but also who attended, and making sure it's always up to date. But those were kind of the ways we do it.
Yeah, and I think that's you raise probably a good point generally, like record keeping, rationale for doing things. I think we all need to be able to demonstrate why and how we're doing things, and that's a really good point, and that's across the board, right? So members must manage conflicts of interest fairly, and in a way that promotes good customer outcomes. Stephen, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. I think that's really important for everybody. I don't want to talk about the word fairly, because I feel like I've been in a room with too many people arguing what the word fairly means. But I think it's really important in terms of good customer outcomes that we do accept the fact that as product providers, we have responsibility for that. And we can do certain very basic common things, I think, to ensure that everybody has a good experience. And a large part of that is looking at your risk management framework and how that folds down, considering different customer types, whether products are suitable. But in terms of that conflicts of interest, how are you managing those conflicts of interest? Do you have them disclosed? Do you have adequate controls and policies in place to ensure that, they don't, because everybody's conflicted in some way, but do you have the controls and the policies in place to identify if that conflict turns too far or is overtly benefiting one side rather than the other?
Yeah, and again, it goes back to the point. It's documenting that, right? That you've considered something, and then what the outcome is. And then the last one, which I feel like we've kind of talked about throughout the webinar, but members must treat customers fairly. So I'll open this up to Kristen, Richard, and Stephen for the last standard.
Yeah, this one is, I mean, this is what we're all about, right? We want to make sure we're treating our customers fairly. And certainly, I know you do a lot of, talking with staff and with advisors and such. You talk about, well, what would you do if this was a family member? Because that sometimes is the way kind of people bring in that empathy and trying to think about it in someone else's shoes. So certainly, I think a lot of us will have various review committees, things where if decisions get challenged, how do we have a good, robust procedure around that? Maybe at a claims level or other decisions, depending on, complaints and that sort of thing. Having that good board oversight, making sure that they're across what the business is doing and the decisions that we're making, having that transparency, that's all, good customer outcomes. And then how do you do that kind of regular reporting, and like where we have some, like a customer dashboard type of thing. So we're looking at key metrics and sharing it, getting the insights, and sort of always being restless, like trying to really continuously challenge ourselves to make sure that we're continually thinking about the customer first and asking our questions to ourselves, is this fair for customers?
I love that you use the term being restless, because I think that's really important, that you're always challenging yourself, because I think too often we get into this mode and we're just like, oh, yes, we've got that sorted out. But everything's so fluid. Products are fluid. Economies are fluid. At certain times, people, if you look at risk, people might be claiming on one thing more than the other. It is quite important that you're looking in a fluid way in terms of how customers are treated fairly.
Yeah, completely agree. So look, I think that brings us to the end of the discussion around the code and the standards. So we do have a couple of minutes for some Q&A. We do have a couple of questions that have come through. So there is one question around, and Richard, this one might be for you, but what sort of oversight or monitoring has the FSC done or plan to do? What if there's a breach? How does the FSC get notified? What happens? And how do the investigations work?
Thank you, Charlotte. So there's a fair bit in that question. So the first bit is, if you will, the code's got three parts. Obviously, you got the code and the code guidance, which is the substance of how we do. We had a long conversation and a lot of debate when we were creating the code around attestations. Everything ranged from, do we need to get people, organizations, members to fill out forms monthly, quarterly, half yearly or annually, to verify that they are staying on track. And where we ended up is, we kind of took both a high trust model on the one hand, but also a pragmatic view on the other hand. And that is that once a year when we renew our membership, there's a whole bunch of questions we ask members, and one of the questions is around the code, compliance with the code, and the overarching principle is there's a no surprises policy. So you wouldn't be surprised to know that from time to time, either a phone call will come in or a letter will come in that's giving the FSC a heads up on something that might be brewing in the background. So that's kind of how we do that. Early on in the piece, we spent a lot of time with a lot of stakeholders, political and regulatory stakeholders. And one of the key messages was, if you're going to have a code, it needs to have teeth. So that if there are breaches, there are informal breaches, accidental breaches, but if they're deliberate breaches, that you actually have a process to manage those. And the FSC's got an independent disciplinary committee made up of a number of very learned and august legal minds. And so that's the separation of powers, if you will. So when something egregious turns up, it'll turn up into the disciplinary committee process. Disciplinary committee process will review it. There's been a couple of fairly searching conversations that have happened in that process. And we've tested it out, but so that's how it works. The disciplinary committee has a lot of powers. It can fine, it can ban, it can sanction, it can do a whole lot of things and advise the board on a range of different matters. So that's kind of how the separation works. What we found is that since the code came into effect back in 2018, actually a lot of the standards in the sector, because of all the other regulatory stuff that's been going on, have been lifting. And so the conduct and culture, review, for example, found a lot of stuff, and we're still seeing some of that come into light, if you're reading various media releases. But a lot of that tracks back to the conduct and culture review. So the overarching focus on risk and governance, strengthening systems, asking the questions, how do you know, all of these things, we've seen fundamental change in the sector over the last 5 years since the code's been in operation, in part because of the code, but very much in part because of what else has been going on in the marketplace. And I think that's a good thing. So we've played our part, but we've played our part in amongst many other levers that are out there.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. There is just one other question. I'm just conscious of time, but there is a question, which is quite a good question. I think we're all probably still grappling with a bit, is we use the term good customer outcomes. Should it not be fair customer outcomes, as not always the outcome is good for the customer, but it may be a fair outcome for a situation. And look, I think we've been using good customer outcomes for a number of years, and as COFI sort of moved towards fair treatment, treating customers fairly. So Stephen, do you have any views? He's just muted himself.
Sorry, I've been in too many rooms where there's been too many passionate discussions about this for too long. I don't think
it's probably one. It haven't quite landed yet.
It merits more discussion.
Yeah, I agree.
Sorry,
Kristen, I think you're nodding in the same.
Yeah, but I think.
Yeah,
it's a conversation I think a lot of us have been having. So I think there was the decision to keep it, but certainly, this gets reviewed every few years. So maybe it'll have evolved to that point that might be the next logical step, is that we switch over to fair customer outcomes. Yeah. Take the point for sure.
Thanks. Well, look, that brings us to the end of the webinar. So look, I just want to take this opportunity to thank Kristen and Stephen for taking the time to join the panel session today. And look, I'll hand over to Richard for some last words.
Very, very short and sweet. Charlotte, thank you. This is a webinar that comes out of the code thinking, which is about let's make it more visible. Let's do some outreach and training and discussion in and amongst all things that we do. So that leadership comes from you, Charlotte, and your code governance team. A big thank you to our SMEs, Steve and Kristen, and to all the people who've kind of participated over a lot of years to get the code to where it is. If you've got any other ideas for webinars and you want to hear stuff, whatever it might be, it's a really easy format to pull together. So on behalf of all of us in the room virtually, a big thank you to our 3 starring presenters today, with a round of applause. And for that, thanks very much.
Great job, Charlotte.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Cheers, folks.
See you later.
Bye for now.